Welcome again to the Sutherland Report. Thank you for joining me. One of the incredible pleasures I have of doing this and really pushing to get this off the ground is that I then can connect with contacts of mine who are in this fight, and to actually, for a change, have a conversation about what is going on over here. So I'm now going to introduce a friend of mine, Robert Oulds, who is the longtime director of the Bruges Group, and I will immediately get him to explain that, and then we will get into our Brexit fight from 2016 and what has gone on over the last nearly 8 years. Can you believe how time flies? Robert, thank you so much for joining me today. It is lovely to see you. And just for viewers who will eventually see this, you and I have actually physically met. We had a very nice drink in London with another mutual contact of yours, Neil McRae, and I look forward to interviewing him as well. But Robert, thank you so much for your time and the wonderful opportunity to talk about British politics and what is actually going on at the moment. Robert, could you explain briefly, or take as long as you want, the history of the Bruges Group, your role in that, etc.?
Well, it's great to see you again, Mark, and it's been many drinks in London that we had, and Birmingham as well as I recall.
Yes,
It's
yeah.
great to be back in touch, and real pleasure to be on your show and in front of your viewers.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
the
you.
Bruges Group, we're a think tank. We're founded by Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher made a speech, a very famous, very influential and controversial speech in September 1988, where set out her vision for Britain, which would be not consumed within the emerging European Union, the European Community as it was known then, where, of course, powers being centralized around Brussels and, of course, later Frankfurt as well, with the decisions made by an unelected, unaccountable elite that would be over-regulating, strangulating the life out of national democracy and national countries, and of course that very special spark that makes the English-speaking world so successful. And the European Union was trying to strangle that, and Margaret Thatcher was saying no and setting out her alternative vision, which is Britain in the wider world, actively participating with other countries, a free economy, lower taxation, competition, and protecting our alliance with the United States, which is being undone by the EU, which has its own military ambitions. And Margaret Thatcher set out her vision, and that transformed British politics, along with the work of the Bruges Group, which did the intellectual work setting out this vision and creating Britain as an independent state, which is what we are again. And despite what many people, the doom mongers, say, Britain is outperforming, even though we've got our own difficulties because our own conservative government has actually failed to honour the principles set out by Margaret Thatcher. But it's still outperforming those economies on the continent, that of the European Union. And of course, our trade has actually increased since we left the EU. So Brexit is a success. We can do so much more, and there's so much more still to be done. That is undeniable. But the work of the Bruges Group, we set out our intellectual vision of an independent country, not being pushed around by foreign institutions, and of course having our own government which would be accountable to us and not overly mighty over the citizens of a country who should indeed be sovereign.
Robert, in June 2016, if my memory serves me correct, 17,410,752 people, with a majority of over a million, made a democratic decision to leave the European Union. Since then, you, and many other people were involved. I felt, this is my opinion, it's as though we felt a fight with our own government, and then we realized the establishment, the elites that are behind that, in the fact that they did not want to honor that vote at all. Robert, you've laid out brilliantly when you've said, despite what is going on, despite the media, etc., we have left. I'm not being rude. Have we really left? What are we going to do? Why have the Conservatives not ripped up the thousands and thousands of laws, etc.? Why have they not say, well, we're gonna charge out of this and charge out of that? Why? I could be wrong. Do people feel that that has not happened?
Yeah, well, I started at the Bruges Group in 2001, and we worked ever so hard over more than 15 years for myself to get that referendum victory, along with others, in June 2016. Of course, the Bruges Group has been going since the early days of 1989, shortly after Margaret Thatcher's speech, and she's our founder president. Of course, that was a really strong, long battle. But the fight only really began when we had won that referendum. Then we really had a fight on our hands, because they were trying to undo the referendum. It was the biggest mandate in British politics ever, the biggest turnout in a referendum. If it was a vote for government, it would be an overwhelming majority in the British House of Commons. It was most parliamentary seats. The voters there voted for Brexit, voted to leave the European Union, but the establishment tried to undo it. They tried to talk it down. People were insulted, made out that they were deplorable for exercising their democratic rights. Politicians tried to row back, even though they said, "Oh, we'll honour the results of the referendum." They tried to absolutely ignore it. And then, of course, what finally happened is that they signed an exit agreement, a withdrawal agreement with the European Union, but it kept us tied to many elements of European Union law. Section 29, as I recall, of the withdrawal agreement means our domestic law can't be incompatible, shall I say, with European Union law. And the hundreds of thousands of pages of regulations still apply. They haven't been ripped up, even those that we would like to get away with, even those that we can dissolve. They haven't been replaced yet. They've still been kept in force. That, to a degree, is normally normal, but you would expect some action. You would accept some acknowledgement that we are independent. We're going to do our own thing. We haven't, of course, in many areas, and there is this elite, and unfortunately the Conservative Party's not been doing what it says on the tin, as we like to say here. They've been tied to the civil servants, doing what they want, and the interest of the Foreign Office, which sees its role. That's for viewers, the Foreign Office is the government department that's similar to what would be in the United States, the State Department.
Yeah.
The Foreign Office sees its role as representing foreigners, and of course, big corporate interests, rent-seeking corporations, want to keep us tied to the EU because its regulations damage competitiveness. It means new entrants into the market can't compete because they've got to get over this massive hurdle of rules, of box ticking. And we've had an economy, a vision of Margaret Thatcher, which was about incentives. It was about investment. It was about inducements. It was about innovation, with one replaced with one of box ticking and having to cross T's and dot I's, and about compliance and obligations and pointless, in some cases, pointless rules. And that's been kept in place. To some degree, those rules come from even above the European Union, the whole process of going towards globalization. But the European Union is particularly anti-competitive and does its best to make sure that member states of the EU and those in neighbouring countries, those it has trade agreements with, have to honour their human rights rules, which are charters for all kinds of diversity that damages the fabric of our society, yet of course doesn't protect people's human rights when they want to exercise their basic freedoms, such as going out their house during lockdowns, for instance. But we'll come to that later, no doubt. And so the European Union still kept its hold to a degree on Britain, and the corporate interests support that. And one of the key things they also like is and they're open about this. They don't actually hide it. They're blatant. they want the open immigration because it keeps wages low. And this is something that's not even controversial in that it's happening because they're open about it. As I said, Lord Rose, the chairman of the Remain campaign, was arguing that we shouldn't leave the European Union because it could lead to less immigration, and that would mean that wages increase. That's why they want immigration, because of course it's more cheap labor. It means that if you increase the quantity of something, no doubt the value decreases. So that's very beneficial for those at the top. It's damaging our economy in the long term, because immigration means more demand for housing and public services, which in a small island like the UK, like Britain, and of course the most crowded major nation on earth, which is England, means that we really can't accommodate any more. But that suits them. Of course, it also means if we're taking on more immigrants, more cheap labor, it means there's less investment in technology and tooling, when of course that then damages productivity. So we have a corporatist elite that wants us tied to the EU because it allows more immigration, and that's why, of course, one reason a lot of people voted to leave the EU was that immigration would finally be got under control. That has not happened. So in a sense, to a degree, Brexit has been betrayed by those who were pledged, whose election manifestos, the documents which they stood on and which the public voted on, and we would think they would implement once in power, was not honoured. There has been a betrayal, and we've just seen this kowtowing to a corporate interest, and we need to be very, very careful about our democracy going forward, because it's in the hands of those that don't have our best interests at heart, that want to turn us into a very different nation, all for their bottom line.
Robert, I don't think I could have said it better myself. And the bottom line is that in many ways we are trying to pack so much in for just under an hour. And personally, I hope that we're going to do this time and time again, because there is so much to explain, and there are, within a lot of friends in America, the parallels of fight, as you quite rightly say, in regard to immigration and what's happening on the Texas border is exactly the same, but also weaponized for a different reason. And just to say that as a nation, we fit into Texas 2.5 times, just over 2.5 times. We in America as a continent, as a legal population of 320 million, most probably far more than that. We then have a population of 68, 70 million within the UK. Robert, you've laid it out in regard to the corporate interests. You've just said about the threat of our democracy, which going forward. Why have these elites think that they are that arrogant where they can actually ignore a democratic vote? I remember within Parliament where every single member of Parliament, every single party rather, was saying, I think it's better that we leave in the EU. And I publicly turned around and said, I feel as though I'm living in a communist state. It's as though our democracy is just being ripped up in front of our eyes. Where do we go from here, Robert?
Well, what I think is actually happening is what a great man actually predicted in the 1980s, and that's Ronald Reagan. He said, if fascism ever comes to America, it will come in the name of liberalism.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we have. Of course, he then went on to define what fascism was. It was private ownership, but complete government control. And that's the system which we are moving towards. It's very reminiscent of China. That's a system which they are seemingly borrowing from. Of course, many of the elites are in hock to China. Of course, China no doubt will have its problems with its declining population, and there's housing bubble may be bursting. But at this point in time, they're running the world, and elites look to this and think this is a model that they can follow. It's a system where, of course, they've taken advantage of technology to take away people's freedom. Now, the internet, for instance, social media, we thought they could be great liberating things, and certainly it is great because you and I are getting our voice out there over the media of the internet, and that's a good thing. There's a double-edged sword, of course, because it's also a system of control which they're weaponizing in China with their social credit system, where of course if you're putting the wrong things on social media, you will then have your rights taken away. And in fact, it's not too different here. We have a system that is informal. There was of course the phenomenon that if you say the wrong thing, you could indeed lose your job. It actually goes much worse than that. In the UK, there's 3,000 arrests each year for people saying the wrong thing on social media. 3,000 out of a population of nearly 70 million. In Russia, for saying the wrong thing on social media, a country that is at least double the size of the UK's population, about 140 million, there's around 400 arrests for people saying the wrong thing on social media. It goes, we have, the world is diverging into two authoritarian camps. Of course, you have the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and all the countries that are joining them, all the countries that have resources mainly. And of course, they are not free. They have one version of authoritarianism, which is deplorable, and it's not for us. It's against every instinct that the English-speaking world used to have, and that was a key part of Anglo-Saxon society and culture going back to time immemorial, that we took to the world. Representative democracy, private property rights, freedom of speech, free markets, all the things that underpin and create and preserve and enhance freedom came from the English-speaking world, but they're now being thrown away by an elites which are the Build Back Better. We know to remember that every single government, from the United States to Canada to the UK, Australia, they're all in hock to the World Economic Forum. We're having that phrase, Build Back Better, and the world is divided into two hemispheres, BRICS versus Build Back Better, and neither of them are actually fighting for freedom. You and I are, Mark, we are, because we advocate those principles, but they're being undone, and that's why that's one of the key reasons, no doubt, why they want to replace our population with newcomers from a world, parts of the world where freedom is less well known, where people are more compliant, that we won't be doing things like voting for Brexit or voting in people like Donald Trump that will do as they're told. And I think that is part of the attraction of why the Democrats, no doubt, in the United States want more immigration. Of course, it's the cheap labor. It is hopefully they would get a compliant population where an employer can just press a button on an app and get a load of workers there and undercut those who've been already employed by them. It is an attack on our rights and our freedom, and of course our prosperity, to serve the interests of a few men right at the very top that just want to have a system where they profit. In a sense, it's a neo-technocratic form of feudalism that whereas feudalism kept people tied to the land, this of course is actually damaging the land. It's actually damaging farming. It's actually damaging those who want to make a living from within their communities and in the area that they've lived and their families have lived for generations, forcing people to be this mobile international workforce that can be exploited at someone's will. That's the system that they're pushing for, and we have to resist that and make sure our democracy is protected. It's in very grave situation at the moment, and protect our own rights to have property and our own rights to have our own property owning democracy, which is what Margaret Thatcher's vision was, which actually thoroughly opposed to the World Economic Forum vision of you will own nothing. Margaret Thatcher wanted people to own their own home, to have opportunities, to engage, to have a real stake in the economy through ownership of their own land, their own home, and of course partaking in the economy, owning shares that, of course, is not what our elites want. They want to restrict that, and they want to make sure that we are controlled. And that, of course, is a recipe for impoverishing people. But that
Absolutely.
that doesn't concern those at the very top, because, of course, they have this contempt for ordinary people, who they would presume are useless. You used to have this phrase, useless eaters, whereas people on what was known as the left were actually openly arguing for, many socialists actually arguing for eugenics and inhuman policies like that, and actual thought that sterilizing the poor, for instance, or those that wouldn't adapt to their new order should be essentially got away with. Those views, of course, are not openly expressed, but they are preserved among some who have a contemptible attitude and actually want to reduce the population of the earth. There is various organizations that openly campaign for that. They may be maybe fringe, but they're not completely without influence. And some people openly believe, whereas we had before useless eaters, now you've got useless breathers, that we're producing too much carbon dioxide, which they relabel as carbon, a natural life-giving gas. And yet they ultimately, I think it comes down to wanting to make sure that those at the bottom don't have opportunity and don't get in the way of the environmental extremism of those at the very top, that use these policies essentially to impoverish and keep those keep ordinary people in their place and prevent them having the opportunity to advance in society, which is what Margaret Thatcher wanted.
Brilliant, Robert. I'm delighted you're saying all this, because people accuse me of being a conspiracy theorist, and you've just blown an absolute hole in all of them to say, no, this is true. This is absolutely true.
They're open about it.
Well, they are.
They're open. They don't want us. They'll fly in private jets around the world to tell us that we've got to change a light bulb.
Absolutely,
it's absurd. Take, for instance, let's play devil's advocate and presume that carbon dioxide has an effect on the climate. Let's just ignore the fact that there's saturation of infrared radiation within CO2, and if we produce more CO2, it cannot lead to an increase in temperature. Let's just ignore that fact, and let's just pretend. Let's play the fairy story. Let's go down the rabbit hole and pretend that it does have an impact. Well, in the UK, we're being a country that produces less than 1% of global emissions. Only 15% of our energy actually is in the form of electricity, and we are being told that we have to change a light bulb for that 15% of a fraction of the CO2 emissions, which is in the global scheme of things absolutely negligible. It has no effect. But what it does do is it impoverishes people, and it forces us to pay more for our energy, and also it means we have to pay more for our energy, and we have to subsidize certain providers.
Yes.
And yet we're told to feel good about paying more for something which doesn't essentially work, such as a wind farm, for instance. It is absolutely absurd. It is a con trick, and the easiest way to make money for your corporation is to get a government contract and then run a monopoly on behalf of the government. It's a story that is as old as the hills. That's what used to happen in medieval England, for instance. There would be a monopoly awarded by the king, in some cases a queen, to an individual or company to run an area, or indeed to have a monopoly on the supply of whatever that may be. That was done away with because it was seen for what it was, absolutely corrupt. But now we have exactly the same system, and we're being tricked into paying more for things when there should be an open, competitive market where people can compete and those who are inefficient will fail, and those who are more able and provide a better service at a better price, no doubt, will be able to succeed. But always, and if they go too mighty, they'll be broken up, like Theodore Roosevelt did in the United States. If a provider becomes too powerful, then of course we need antitrust legislation. We need the Monopolies and Mergers Commission to get involved and break them up. That's not the world we have. We have a system which has emerged where no doubt it did infinitely better than a state-owned monopoly or communism or state socialism, to be more correct. But still, it's not as competitive as what it should be. We have social media techs operating as a cabal, and of course they do. Adam Smith, the Scottish Enlightenment theorist, he was quite clear. If you get a room of industrialists together, put them in a room, they're going to form a cabal. That's what happens, and that's what happens here. And we've got a system which is so many suppliers are. No wonder prices are going up so high, because of course they are operating as a cabal. Prices go up, but they're still record profits. And essentially, most of them are owned by State Street, Vanguard, BlackRock. If you trace it all back, there's a woke cabal, the woke industrial complex, running things and pushing things because it serves their bottom line against the better interests of our nation state and our culture and the things which made us great in the first place, which they do not seem to be in a mind to tolerate. And we need to push back again. We need to push back against this, and we need more politicians like Margaret Thatcher, which will give opportunity to those at the least well off, and of course Theodore Roosevelt at the same time, and who would break up the monopolies and bring down those that are seemingly too powerful.
What I just one of the lovely things I do, because I believe in buying books. I have a library. Books have information, and I want to definitely get to your latest book because you are an amazing writer. But this particular book by Bataillon, to some controversial, but an extremely very good book. Of course, to some it is controversial because people don't want to face the truth. That particular book lays out what you've just said in regard to immigration into the European Union and the European pan-axis with Arabia. She talks about that. And what I'm delighted and thrilled by having this conversation with you is just going, Robert, have the floor, because for us, conversation is so good for our mental health. And I think particularly as men, that's a huge issue at the moment. And the fact that we feel that, no, we can't say this, we can't say that. We can and we must, because we are fighting on behalf of everyone else. We don't want this tyranny. You raise Margaret Thatcher. I want to ask you, Margaret Thatcher had an interesting journey, didn't she? Because you could argue when Ted Heath took us into the EU, and there they are, as this he's got this little paragraph saying, you know, in their manifesto, I'm going to take us into the EU. And that is another huge story, links with Jean Monnet and all the rest, going back to Arthur Sauter, League of Nations, all the rest. Interesting characters flowing around there. What was her journey? Because would it be fair to say, I saw it, would it be fair to say that at one point she was very pro joining, joining the common market, because of a number of countries that were then able to trade with each other with having trade barriers low or non-existent, less control, where actually you and I would say that from far earlier than that, it's always been the common market journey into the European Union, into this federal state of Europe without a constitution and undermining people's rights. What do you say about her journey, Robert? What's your take on that?
Yeah, Margaret Thatcher at a time, particularly in the 1970s, supported what was known as the European Economic Community. Of course, that was a mistake. Of course, Margaret Thatcher, she told me later, said we should never we shouldn't be in the EU. We should never have joined the EU. And of course came out for Brexit, and have also, well, before, of course, it was known as Brexit, it came out for leaving the European Union. And of course, also for many years back was against the growth of more power. She told MPs to vote against the Maastricht Treaty, which I'll come to all this. Basically, at the time, it was thought that Britain was ungovernable. We had rampant politicized trade unions that were literally on strike. You had grave diggers on strike in support of the teachers, who were on strike in support of the miners. Ignore their own sort of issues, their own grievances that they may have. There was sympathy strikes here. The country couldn't be run. We had learnt the wrong lessons from the Second World War. There was this fixation with Russia and the Soviet Union. I thought, well, okay, that's the way to go. And they thought that if there was more state control and the state ownership of industry, then the country will be more will be stronger, and we'll be better off. Of course, the absolute reverse was true, and some conservatives who thought that we couldn't run our own country because, of course, the Labour Party was rampant, and its trade unions. The Labour Party essentially being a creature of the trade unions, or some trade unions, of course, I'll come to, are actually very, very useful. But at the time, the major organisations were political, and they were there to push for more state control. And some people thought, well, if we join the European Economic Community, they have legislation against state control. They actually prevent that. They want to keep private ownership. Of course, what they didn't realize is that it was corporatist, and that corporatism, of course, is a philosophy. It's a rebrand, essentially, of fascism, which came out of socialism. And fascism seeks to resolve class conflict by bringing everybody together within the state and putting them all around the table: trade unions, business leaders, political representatives, all under the leadership of one person. And that was their idea. And that, of course, didn't get a popular, doesn't have popular branding after the Second World War, but in the continent of Europe, it remained alive. Ideas like that were very strong. In fact, they go back quite some considerable time and are cultural in their instances. And so Britain joined this European Economic Community thinking, well, we can't run ourselves. Let's get those people across the water to run us. Absolute betrayal, treasonous, I know, but that's what they thought, and thought that, okay, those economies are growing, we're declining. Of course, Britain had declined from the leading power in Europe, and of course global power, to, of course, a third-rate nation in the 1970s. And it took Margaret Thatcher really to put the great back into Great Britain, and she did that by her background as her father being a small businessman, and of course herself being an exceptionally able lady and a scientist with great attention to detail and an absolute drive. She knew that small businesses, private ownership, private enterprise was the way to go, and reinvigorating that spark of competition and element, and getting the economy working again. And it absolutely transformed. Of course, he also wanted to fight the culture war as well, but we'll come to that later as well, no doubt. But Margaret Thatcher, of course, slowly then realised that, okay, we're part of the European Economic Community, but they're taking our money. They're taking far more. With the British taxpayers being ripped off, she got some of our money back, not all of it. It was an imperfect, as always, because things relating to negotiations in the European Union never get a good result for one side. There's always some kind of messy compromise. Got some of our money back. That was a victory. But then the European Union continued to push for more control. It was pushing to open up borders across the continent of Europe, impose more regulations, and Margaret Thatcher eventually said, no, this is too much. I'm going to put out an alternative vision, an alternative positive vision of how things should be done. Even though her vision was positive and far more common sense, and fits in with what what the British people actually largely want, who've never been fully committed to the European project as it's known. She was then removed from office for doing so, and that was a key reason why Margaret Thatcher was replaced as Prime Minister in 1990, and it kind of sort of all went pretty downhill from there. We had the men in grey suits running the Conservative Party again. We were tied to the exchange rate mechanism. Thankfully, we came out of that policy, but we had the premiership of John Major, who was like Tony Blair, but very grey. No actual spark there, apart from he was just following the same policies. And then, of course, we had Tony Blair come into power, who was elected as a Labour leader. He was on the left, of course, as politics as it would be seen, and of course he hated the traditional aspect of Britain, and he wanted to change Britain constitutionally, and there was lots of constitutional innovations which of course endangered the unity of the kingdom, and also led to more legal involvement, lawyers making the laws rather than just interpreting them. That had emerged. But one of the key things is, according to people within the new Labour organisation that was running the country, they wanted to rub the right's noses in diversity, and they opened the borders and allowed in literally millions of people. There had been very little, some immigration into the UK since 1066. There had been very little immigration since then. It was some. There was the Huguenots, various other people, all very small, all easily ignored. In 1997, or shortly after, they opened the borders essentially, and mass migration began, and it hasn't been stopped. And in fact, the Conservative government at the moment actually has record levels of migration, which surpasses that which Tony Blair inflicted on the country. An absolute betrayal. And that's one reason why they're facing a defeat at the next general election, not because the Labour Party is popular. It's led by someone, Sir Keir Starmer, who makes John Major look dynamic and exciting. He has a charisma bypass. Yet, of course, he is on course to be the next Prime Minister, because, of course, Conservatives are largely, perhaps it's a good idea, perhaps it's not, sitting on their hands and saying, sorry, we're not going to vote for the party led by Rishi Sunak that is doing everything that the Labour Party would do and Conservatives should be opposed to. Mass immigration, the highest level of taxation since the Second World War, since there was a red in tooth and claw Labour government after the Second World War, nationalisation of industries, state policies, replication of the Soviet Union, rationing, enforced rationing. You couldn't buy what you wanted in the shops. You could only buy what the government permitted you to buy. If you had a coupon, then of course you could go to the shops and buy enough food for your family. Only if you had a coupon, you couldn't exceed the what the state allowed you to buy and eat. There was that kind of government. Our taxation at the moment in the UK is equal to that, and of course Conservatives should be for fiscal responsibility. We're in a position where debt to GDP is around 100%. In fact, we can't cut taxes in the UK because so much of our money is actually going off in interest payments, which have been run up as a result of lockdowns, which the Conservative government introduced because Sir Keir Starmer was essentially the Labour leader, was essentially making them. And we ran up this massive debt, ruined the public finances, and the interest payments, not just the payments on the debt, the interest payments on the debt that the country has, that the British government has, is actually greater than the education budget. What future is there for a country that is investing more in paying off those who've essentially exploited the stupidity of a government that was just recklessly borrowing, more than the investing in the education of the next generation and building up what would be a country's greatest asset, its own population. And so we are in a very, very difficult position. And all this time, there's more immigration driving up the cost of living and lowering wages at the same time. So there is this triple whammy hitting ordinary working people in the UK, and times are indeed difficult. And that's one reason why the Conservative Party is in the dreadful situation it is now, because it's not doing what it's meant to be doing, which people voted for. There was former Labour voters that thought that the Conservative government under Boris Johnson, who of course has gone, he's not coming back as Prime Minister, but he had promised to get Brexit done. And at last it seemed that there was a British politician that was determined to stand up for British people rather than being a party for those on benefits or for migrants, which is what, according to David Miliband, a former the other Miliband, thought that the Labour Party had actually become. That's how they viewed themselves. And at last, the Conservative Party did what it was meant to be doing, but of course has actually failed to do so. And so there's a great deal of disenchantment. And all those Labour voters that came over to the Conservatives because they thought they'd stand up for Britain have thought, well, you're all just as bad. And to use a phrase, it's Conservatives and Labour for many people are two cheeks of the same arse, if I may.
I think you're absolutely right. We have a uniparty. I mean, in America, there is a uniparty. A number of people I know in the States, one of their favorite television series from our past is Yes Minister. They actually they watch that, and I encourage them to do so because I think it explains a lot. And one of the things that I'm struck by there is when suddenly a sort of a pivot point in the late 80s, when all this paperwork was coming down the line from bureaucratic control from Europe, and then suddenly feeding into our government, and people going, the bureaucratic mindset were then feeling very comfortable about being told what to do. You're absolutely right. And that phrase that we've forgotten to run our own country, or these people don't want to run our own country. I want to underline something that you've said again about the definition of fascism, which is public-private partnership. Okay. And if there's anyone that really brought that in hindsight's a wonderful thing. And when you've been on a certain political journey like myself, you look back and think, oh my goodness, I didn't see that. And of course, Blair pushed that on steroids. We have to say that. There's also
sorry, another, there is an element of fascism which is identitarian. It judges, of course, originally it wasn't that way, and there was, for instance, there was Jewish people in the fascist party within Italy, but of course that quickly gave way to anti-Semitic extremism, and there was identitarianism, where they judged people according to their ethnicity, to the color of their skin, for instance, and not only judge them as in terms of their ability, but also their morality as well. And we have exactly the same policies coming back now, identitarianism, where of course on the left they will judge people, and if you're a certain ethnicity, you will then be viewed as either a perpetrator or a victim, no matter what class you're actually from, or your socio-economic background, how much property you own, for instance. You're judged according to that. It's the absolute opposite of what people like Martin Luther King Jr. wanted, or anybody from a Judeo-Christian background, where of course people would in theory be judged equally and all have the same moral worth, or the same moral questionableness, if you wish to view it that, and this need to contain our perhaps our darker sides, for instance, but through institutions that we've established over time. But we have exactly the same policies, and in effect, in a sense, it's an inverted form of racism, perhaps a feminine form of racism. Before those people who were fascist or Nazi rather would look upon those who are of a different ethnicity and think that they cannot succeed, they cannot be any good. Now, of course, it's the same. And they're saying we have to have special rules for those who are of a different ethnicity because they're not good enough. That's what they're essentially saying. And that is absolutely alien to the Anglo-Saxon tradition, which classes us as all should have the same opportunity and to raise according to our abilities. And we all have the same moral foundations. Whereas today, these identitarian policies are returning, and they are very prevalent amongst the woke. So these cultural trends don't actually change, and it is actually worrying. We wonder where this is going to end up, because in the run up to the Second World War, there was of course, in various countries there was a boiling frog. A clique would take power. They would pit people, one group against another, and they would then exploit people as they saw fit, and persecute groups which were outside of what they wanted. And that goes back to the writings of Marx and Engels, who thought that those ethnicities that couldn't adapt to socialism should be exterminated. They were quite open about that in the Victorian era. Karl Engels writing about that in Karl Marx's newspaper. They were quite clear about that. And these same ideas are beginning to permeate back in society, and I think we need to resist them.
I couldn't agree more, because as we look, we look at Margaret Sanger in the States, we look at the eugenics movement, we look at where Hitler then got his ideas from, and then expressing the whole Aryan race, and then I'm going to have my Third Reich and rule for 1,000 years, etc., etc. But I'm going to go and exterminate 6 million people. Do me a favor. And you're right, because it's this whole.
But it's those who they think won't conform to their politics. And at this point in time, it's perhaps people like you and I who they think won't conform to their politics. In fact, we don't conform.
No.
We champion liberty, and so there is a prejudice against people based on their ethnicity. Oh, you can't say that because you're of the wrong skin color, for instance. Outwardly you're wrong skin color, and this is being used again by the Democrats in the United States, who have a history of pitting people against other nationalities, other ethnicities rather. That's what they built their power bases on, and they're doing exactly the same thing. And of course, they're just different targets now, and using different groups to attack other groups, and using mass migration essentially to keep themselves in power. And that's what it comes down to.
Absolutely.
There's a few people at the top who are doing this because it enriches them. You'll see sort of large corporations essentially, run by some billionaires that will be pushing this socially what's wrongly described as liberal, but socially liberal agenda, because it essentially enriches them. We're pushing mass migration because it enriches them and enhances their power, and they hope that they're going to get people in who are going to be compliant and be good little serfs and will do as they're told for not very much. And that's what they want, and that is bad for property-owning democracy.
Well, I completely agree, and you're absolutely right, because we look at a number of, and we're just coming into the last sort of 8 minutes really, but you're absolutely right, because a number of us, we've been censored. We know people that of course have been, it's lawfare, deplatformed, etc., because it's like, oh no, you can't say that, you can't say this, and we're going, hold on a minute, what's the issue here? And especially, and I put this out there as a Bible believing Christian, there's a Judeo-Christian framework. That's where I come from. That's my lens. I make no apology for that. And you're absolutely right. It's then be seen as, no, we have to come against you, and it's as if to say, oh, we'll create these camps where we're going to reprogram you. I mean, I'll just say this statement. I mean, what people don't know, when in the past, and I think on another occasion we go into this, because we both love history, And that is what is so inspiring about you, Robert. I'm not just saying it because you're sitting here, but it's true. And to encourage people to go and learn, pick up books, learn from but the previous, what has gone on. And we look at Stalin's Russia, etc. You created gulags. And at one point in this country, I think the first Labour Prime Minister, MacDonald, was on about lending Russia anywhere between 35 to 50 million pounds. Now, I think there was lending, not giving. And what would a tyrant like Stalin have done with that? What, built even more gulags? I mean, people need to know all of this information. Robert, I want you in the last sort of 5 minutes, and I'm going to grab it. I'm just going to bring your book to the screen because I'm proud to have this, and I look forward to meeting you, and I get you to sign it. I've got to read this, but can you talk about because it's just arrived? Could you talk about this book, because you have an interesting comment. How culture determined victory and defeat in the Second World War, World War II, the first culture war by yourself. And then we have got the esteemed, this is the ultimate history of World War, Rear Admiral Roger Lane, not CB. What, briefly in a few minutes, what was your inspiration for writing that, and what's the main headline for that? Where can people find you, buy it, etc.? Go for it, sir.
Thank you, Mark. But yeah, World War II, the first culture war. It's on. You can get it from Amazon, and you can also order it through your bookshop as well. Of course, basically, the realization is that Britain won the Second World War, and Britain and her allies, including the United States and the English-speaking world, essentially, because of ideas that were developed within medieval England, things that go back to the Anglo-Saxon times. So we call that English exceptionism, if you like, and I make no bones about that. But the ideas of representative democracy, horizontal lines of control rather than top-down governments, bottom-up choosing of leaders, free markets, private property, sound money, liberty, in an economy built on incentives and inducements. They were the real weapons that were unleashed on the Nazis, who were national socialists that believed in state control, that had price controls, that took over industry. First, took them into the Reichswerk and Hermann Göring, before all industry was put within the German Ministry of Defense. They were socialists. They were, of course, it was only socialist if you were the right ethnicity. If you were the wrong ethnicity, then you would be cheap labor or slave labor to be exploited. Pretty much similar to the vision of some in the UK and America that want more immigration. And we need to remember that the Nazis were not against immigration. In fact, there was Germany at the end of the Second World War, despite their extermination of Roma, of Sinti, of Jews and other ethnicities, was more ethnically diverse because they took in more people. They took in French factory workers. They took in slave labor from Eastern Europe, put them to work within their industry, cheap labor essentially. And there's a similarity towards those who want immigration into the UK now. Of course, they're not doing the dreadful things, not yet, at least, certainly not, and let's hope not. And hopefully that will never, ever happen again. They won't be able to get away with it. Although, of course, we see in communist China the persecution of the Uyghur minority, something as well as also other religious groups. So these things can happen in the modern world. They can actually happen if we're not careful. So basically, we have the Nazis had a system which was based on state control, exploitation, and the Soviets had a similar system, and it didn't work. And they relied on us for their weapons, even their oil. They had the Caucasus under their control for most of the Second World War, a major oil producing region. Yet to get high octane fuel for planes, it was easier to take that oil from the Caucasus out through Iran to Britain and to the United States, to be shipped back to the Soviet Union to then be used in fighter planes to take on the Luftwaffe. It was easier to do that and cheaper than for the Soviets to do it themselves, because they didn't have an economy properly based on incentives and inducements, and they didn't have meritocracy. They had an institutionalized system of corruption, a kind of industrialized feudalism, where people were told what to do by a manager who was put there not because he was able, but because he knew the right people. A corrupt system, nepotism on an industrial scale. It's bigger than the corruption of the Biden crime family, if you can even believe that. But these ideas that were developed, made in Anglo-Saxon England, which we exported to the United States, made America the great country that it is, and the great ally that it became in the Second World War, the arsenal of democracy that provided so much of the weapons that would be used. And we've forgotten those values. We've forgotten the value of private enterprise and competition, and have a system which is essentially rigged in favor of those who say the right thing. Social advancement is now reserved for those who are on the right side politically, not for those who are the most able, who can provide the best products, who have the best ideas, who have the correct facts and the most persuasive arguments. It's about those who are politically on the right side, or indeed of the right ethnicity, and that's absolutely shameful. But I think they do that for a reason, because they want to put people against each other. But basically, the idea that I realized is that, some people say, oh, it's not battles that win war, it's logistics. Well, actually, it's culture which determines a country's logistics. There's many nations that have the same amount of resources as the United States, for instance, or of course the same population, but are unable to have a proper functioning economy, is because the United States, for instance, has the correct culture to have a properly functioning, growing economy, or at least did before they wanted to change it. And England, a small nation, along with the other parts of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, is a very small nation, yet had such a dramatic effect, not because we had the best logistics or the best most resources. In fact, the reverse. We had a culture of incentives. We had one where there was a profit. We had a professionalized army that was highly trained rather than a mass conscript force. Which
Robert, I don't want to stop you in flow, but I am, because we're up against the time. But
the point is, we had something very special in England, and we're in danger of throwing it away on the altar of mass migration, and we need to preserve this. And the things which gave us victory in the Second World War, we need to understand what exactly that was. We need to understand how we need positive policies to grow our population. Our indigenous population needs to be invigorated within the UK, and of course we need to get our country moving again by restoring our culture and our values that made us great and that made us unstoppable in the Second World War, that we're in danger of throwing away. And that's what the book's about. And we need to about what it is about, learning the lessons from the Second World War and applying them to this day and age, because we're in a struggle now.
Robert, I cannot thank you enough, and I want you back. Right, I'm going to play us out, and thank you so much for joining me. Just stay there. We'll have a conversation afterwards. But bless you. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Let's keep our world in prayer and learning about what's going on. Bless you for joining us.